initiated its own infiltration, if you will. And I remember very, very well, because I was party to the conversations at the beginning, when they invited, they were going to expand this to include more black folks, all right? And white folks, as usual, don't have a good list. When they decide they are going to expand. And so the call went out to Reverend Ben Chavis. All right, I mean, he was recruited actively because I was called to say, to ask, what do you think about us approaching Reverend Ben Chavis? And I said, Reverend Ben Chavis, for what? To a movement that's going to oppose the banks to which Barack Obama is wedded? No, I don't think so. They didn't even understand that Reverend Ben Chavis wrote a weekly column for black newspapers in which Barack Obama was the star of every issue. But they went out and recruited Chavis, who became one of the key actors in Occupy the Dream, which shared the stage with the rest of the Occupy movement. Was that an active infiltration and co-optation by the bankers, et cetera? No, it was by invitation. So the seeds of co-optation and infiltration can sometimes be found right inside the movement itself. When we talk, and Kevin, of course, touched on this, the FBI and other elements of the intelligence apparatuses campaign to entrap poor Muslims and non-Muslims in the so-called, these manufactured terror schemes. It is not just the entrapment, but the infiltration that precedes, that is necessary for the entrapment that we should be looking at. You can't start entrapping until you infiltrate. So what we're really looking at here is massive, of course, infiltration of not just Muslim communities, but poor communities in general. So infiltration and entrapment are part of the standard secret police state operations. I think that we really can't talk about infiltration in the black community without looking at the way the system of mass black incarceration actually operates. It is a system in which the goal appears to be not only to lock up as many young black men as possible, but to get papers on those who are not actually physically incarcerated. That is, bring them under some kind of control of the criminal justice system. And so this blends with standard police operating procedure in terms of creating networks of snitches. And so just in terms of the day-to-day operation of the mass black incarceration system, we have deep, pervasive infiltration of the community for the political project of disempowering, containing, terrorizing, politically neutralizing that community. That is quite enough. It does not need another project. That is the project. And those systems are in place, and we take them for granted, and we even allude to them in television programs on commercial television. But sometimes we don't look at that as a political deep infiltration network. We just look at it as crime and cops and robbers and stuff like that. And this created vast problems for the Black Panther Party that were more fundamental than just sending in political infiltrators, because the infiltrators were already there. The whole network of systematic infiltration of the community existed without having the Black Squad handling the political project. I think, and this goes back to, the watchword today, especially in the wake of the movement that arose after 2014, is community policing. Community policing means whatever the state says it means on any given day. But the real purpose of community policing, the various schemes, at the heart of it is infiltration and political manipulation of the community. The rationale is that what's wrong with black police community relations is a lack of trust, and therefore resources must be committed and new organizations created to further trust between black folks and the police. That actually means infiltrating the community. The goal is to create stronger ties between existing community organizations and the police, to have periodic meetings to forge understandings, and to create new organizations where existing organizations don't have the right kind of relationship with the police. And of course, the state has money. And if you have money, you can create organizations out of whole cloth. And so we really are talking about a political project to give assent to the armed occupation of Black America that has been the salient characteristic of mass black incarceration since the late 60s. So community policing is legitimately part of the discussion of infiltration and co-optation. And now going back to this question of war on terror, and the connection between the United States government and its foreign policy and the international jihadist network. John Pilger just this past week wrote a very, very interesting piece about what he said is described in Britain as the Manchester Boys. And the Manchester Boys were Brits young Brits of Libyan descent, many of whom had been on terrorist watch lists until 2011. When they were on these terrorist watch lists, their travel was restricted. Some of them had their passports pulled. Everybody knew that the eye of the state was on them. And then in 2011, this great offensive began, an offensive that we're still in the midst of, with the assault on Libya. And all of a sudden, the Manchester Boys, who were so dangerous that they were not allowed to travel, many of them, found no trouble traveling at all. And their passports were totally in order, and hundreds more like them, so that they could travel to Libya to be part of the jihadist army that NATO was acting as an air force for, and then on to Syria. So, were the Manchester Boys co-opted? Were they part of an infiltration? You see, these are large questions that aren't answered just with the standard agent and agent provocateur way of looking at these questions. It's part of a larger picture.
People everyone here, please keep your questions short if you can. Thank you. Anyone want to go first?
I'm gonna be summarizing the questions after you say them, so don't make them long, and I'm gonna summarize them for the video, so, with that microphone.
Back there in the blue shirt?
So, the infiltration sounds to have some real problems with the right to assemble. Has there ever been a case in statutory law upholding the right to assemble in opposition to this kind of infiltration?
That's a really interesting question. Does anyone have an answer? I mean, what you're asking basically, is that kind of infiltration illegal because it's violating people's constitutional rights? And there have been, like in Washington DC, there have been pushes to end this kind of infiltration by the DC police. The DC police claim they don't do it anymore, but we've seen that they do. So all we get when we push on that is it being pushed more deeply undercover and harder to find. But I don't see them giving it up. I don't see any court saying they have to give it up. I haven't seen any decision of that sort yet. I think it's a great argument to make.
Okay, thank you. Irving?
Yeah, hi. Question for Kevin. How did you find out that the African American woman was actually an infiltrator, number one?
In which one?
The case you did to show that the African.
Oh, woman, right, yeah.
And in terms of cooptation, could you explain, elaborate the role of nonprofits and foundations in controlling the mass
So the question is, what's the role of nonprofits in co-optation and how what role they play? And then also the question about the last minute visitor to our final meeting, the black woman who we suspect was the infiltrator. What happened actually, what made us lead to her was after the meeting was over, we started talking amongst ourselves as to everyone who talked to her, to see what she had said, on who she knew and why she was there. We got inconsistent stories. And so it became clear she was making up as she was going along. But we didn't realize that until after we'd already been arrested the next day. So it's going back and looking at that. I think the nonprofit community is a very complicated question. There's a big conflict between the big greens and the fresh greens, I like to call them. The people who are doing the blockades, the pipelines and such. This is one example of a number of them. The big greens get a lot of corporate money. We saw there's a half dozen big greens who endorsed NAFTA and were on the verge of endorsing TPP. And luckily the toxic political poison of TPP got too big for them to do it. And so we do see that kind of constant conflict on key issues. I mentioned in the healthcare debate how lots of groups, dozens of groups who had historically supported single payer, switch sides in order to say, because it's the best you can get is insurance-based healthcare, so it'll be universal and have access, and get money, and that totally divided movement prevented us from really having a strong fight back from the left for single payer and against the insurance domination. And there's big funders who will, I've heard stories from people who get that kind of money, who will give the money freely the first year, let you build up your infrastructure, hire people, expand your office, have this ongoing overhead cost, and then in the next year, start to put conditions on it. So after you've gotten yourself into this situation, then you're stuck with people who are depending on their rent and their mortgage, and you have a lease to pay, and you're stuck. So that's a key tactic that you see used. I know I was involved a long time ago in the 90s, before George Soros had the Open Society Fund. He was interested in the drug issue, and I was working on drug policy. And we had a group called Drug Policy Foundation, and our biggest donor, who had been the largest commodities broker in U.S. history and had a libertarian view on drug policy, and began with something like $500,000 a year or something, and we were trying to build up the grassroots base to match that. But he then had a turnaround in his income, and was only making tens of millions of dollars a year, around hundreds of millions. And so he wanted to back out, and then George Soros came on the scene. And Soros was interesting. I mean, really it was interesting dealing with him. He wasn't as notorious then, but he probably should have been. What he did was he invited us over to his house for dinner, and had a debate in front of him between legalizers and prohibitionists. So we brought in some of the best prohibitionists, some of the best legalizers. We got to debate in front of George Soros. We got to help him think through what he wanted to do. It was pretty interesting. And so then Ira Glasser was the head of the ACLU at the time, said to Soros, if you're going to support legalization, you should fund it. Give these guys $25,000 to write a proposal for you. That's to us. Write a proposal to you to fund a legalization movement. So we gave us $25,000 to write a proposal. And so we did this whole long proposal about how we're going to change the world on drug policy, change the mindset of people, and change the political culture, all sorts of polling and focus groups and protests and legislation and referendums, all sorts of stuff. Then about 6 months into it, Soros invited us over to his house for breakfast. We came up and had breakfast at his house. And he says, I'm just not ready to support legalization. I'm busy with lots of things. I can't think it through. I don't want to make the mistake the DEA makes and have unintended consequences. So I can't commit to that. And he says, plus you guys don't have any big names or anything. You don't have any senators, or you have no big business people. I'll be getting in first. And I interrupted and I said, well, George, that's because most people like you, they get afraid to take on this controversial issue. It's a third rail political issue, and most people get to this point like you do, and they chicken out. And and then he said, well, what I would support that would not cause trouble. And he said, I do this a lot in my European funding. Like I'll support a cancer center or a glaucoma clinic, and then they'll give me a foot in the door to make my political arguments and funding. And he said, I would support, efforts at harm reduction, to reduce the harm from drugs, treatment programs, needle exchange, overall harm reduction, methadone, easy access to methadone, that kind of thing. And so he said, well, I said, that would be great, but that's probably going to cost you even more, because then you're talking about clinics and staff, and it's a whole different ballgame. So he had us do a proposal on that, and he did finally give money for that, and that became a grant program, and he gradually moved toward being a legalizer. My experience, though, was I didn't last very long in that organization once we got Soros funding. Soros wanted to bring his own person in to direct it, and so we were going to have a triumvirate, me and the academic who co-founded the organization with me. And Soros had called me at one point and said, I'm ready to support this, but I don't trust your colleague. I think he's not capable. He's reaching 65, 75 years old. He wasn't as aggressive, and he really wanted to keep it small and control it. And I wanted a large, big movement. And so we did. Soros did notice a conflict between us, which was interesting. And rather than joining Soros and attacking my colleague, I defended my colleague, which was probably my mistake. I was loyal. And by the time we worked through getting the money, I had to keep explaining to my partner why Soros didn't trust him. So that put me in a very uncomfortable position to explain that. So by the time we actually got the money, and it was a triumvirate, it was a 2-to-1 against me triumvirate. And so I was quickly knocked out of that. I came in one morning early, and they were in the room having a meeting with some guy I didn't know about, and I came in and sat down. And I said, you're not supposed to be here, Kevin. They said, why not? I said, well, we'll tell you later. And so and the guy who was there meeting with was the guy who was going to find me my new job. He was like some corporate headhunter type, and I was going to be a CEO or something. But anyway, so I didn't get very much time under Soros. But in reality, Soros did make a tremendous difference in the marijuana movement. Him and a few other people did fund voter initiatives. And now there's lots of conflicts and problems with that, because when you do voter initiatives, you have to do what the voters will vote for and not what you necessarily want. So it's getting a very commercialized marijuana market. There's rumors that somehow Soros is going to profit from that commercialized market. I don't know. But that's my experience with Soros and his co-opting kind of effort.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah, I just have a question. If you're in an organization and you have a hunch, or you would like to know, because there's a lot of problems in there, you'd like to know the extent to which it's infiltrated, or the extent to which it's real. Have you ever had any success with Freedom of Information Act requests?
No. The question was, do FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, help us find out who the informants are so we can understand how infiltrated we are? There's a law enforcement exception to ongoing investigations to FOIA that pretty much blocks you from finding it out. And it's a slow process, so by the time you got through the process, most likely the moment in the movement would be over. And so it'd be too slow and they have too many exceptions.
Right there.
Yeah, in this highly surveilled culture that we live in, where young people, and I'm saying that from the point of view of an older person, seem to have less understanding or respect for the need for privacy, what is to be learned from the Comitel Pro program and how disruptive it was to political organizations? Meaning consensus-based groups that have affinity groups that may work in dialectic with the consensus.
The question was, what do we do with, what can we tell young people about COINTEL program and how it disrupted movements, and how do we deal with affinity groups that may be working in opposition to what the consensus of the group is? Very tough question. I mean, I do think people, when they hear the story I told you today, you know, about how movements have been infiltrated and what that has meant as far as numbers of infiltrators, and 1 out of 6 in Camayo's campaign, 1 out of 6 in the 1968 protest, how widespread it is. That it's an eye-opener for most people. People don't really recognize that. And if you give them the places they can search to, you know, search COINTELPRO, search death assassinations of Black Panthers, or, you know, you can search these things and it's all out there. And I think it's a fascinating history that people can very quickly realize is important. Now, there are going to be differences, as far as your second point, there are going to be differences among people in a campaign. And they have their own tactics, and the question, how do you relate to them if they are opposite of yours? And first of all, I think that when you're working in a coalition, the key thing is the coalition has to have a common vision of where you want to go. What's your goal? What's your mission? And once you have that mission, then you can talk about what is our strategy. And the strategy is a broad, a broad-based strategy. How are we going to get there? Lobbying, protest, whatever. And then you get down to tactics where the differences are. And so once you have that broader framework of a common strategy and common vision, and you get to tactics, you can have a pretty good discussion and really come up with a common series of tactics, usually. Sometimes you can't. And then I think what you have to do is to create agreement between, and this depends on the circumstance, but the preference would be not to be criticizing each other, but to creating time and space that separates the various actions, so it's clear that one group's not part of another group's actions. I think if you can create that time and space, you can often operate. Sometimes the tactic is too damaging, and you can't even be that. Time and space is not enough. But those are the preferences, as far as I'm concerned, about how you approach that kind of difference in tactic.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. I think there needs to be some kind of database or some kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval of some sort to be stamped on what entities and what funding sources in particular are clean. Because, I mean, anyone who gets money from the Ford Foundation, for example, I remember the National Student Association. The Ford Foundation was one of the original conduits for the CIA to corrupt anything after World War II. And it was 100% successful, and it still is today. Now, I know they also do some good stuff, but at the end of the day, you have to, it's enough for people to understand this brief lesson that I had back in the 80s. And so, does anything exist to help people, especially young people, know who are the good guys and who are the bad guys who they're hanging out with?
So the question was about creating a database, which I think would be great, but very difficult task, and some history of the Ford Foundation, which is, I think the Ford Foundation is an interesting story by itself in its role in directing movements. And we can learn a lot from that. That's a whole nother an hour lecture on that. But I don't know of any database like that. And you know, even when we thought about it, Popular Resistance, doing a list of trusted advocacy groups, it gets very hard. It gets very hard because there's a mix. even groups that we have suspicion with, we work with them in coalitions. You know, I'll work with Democrats. That's saying a lot. But you know, that's part of the reality of getting things done politically. You have to have a broad coalition. And so you start to make a list of this group's bad, that group's not, I think you're going to cause more problems yourself. So I don't see that. And I guess the same is probably true to foundations too. I hate to say it, but it's a hard, I don't know a database like that. If anyone else does, let us know.
There's gotta be a process for screening, and it's not impossible, so that's all I'm
I agree.
bringing up.
No, we do need databases. Well, we need all the information we can get, and then we decide what we do with the information. But we need the information to have the conversation. The Ford Foundation is one of the organizations that together has contributed millions of dollars to what's broadly called the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, and so of course the conversation would be, what will the political impact on that movement be? One does not know, but the first article that I ever wrote in long form for a magazine was in 1975 for Essence magazine. And the title was, "The Revolution Will Not Be Subsidized." And it was about these organizations, the residue of the 60s movement, who had become dependent in the late 60s and the early 70s on money from what we used to call the God Box. The God Box was that building on the Upper West Side where the mainstream Protestant churches are headquartered. And that was the box from which so some large amounts of money in the late 60s was Mau from those churches. And it's a matter of political interpretation as to whether that infusion of money, what impact that infusion of money had on the political behavior of the organization. But what definitely unfolded was that when the God Box fathers and mothers decided that black liberation was no longer in vogue, but Native Americans and ecology were, these black organizations were cut off. And having become dependent, had forgotten how not to be, and they withered and they died. Thus, the revolution will not be subsidized. And so we know what happened last time, and we have to be speaking of these large donations from the Ford Foundation and others to Black Lives Matter with that kind of history in mind.
Yeah, can you speak of on the occasion when leadership needs to speak directly and publicly about its would-be opponents? I'm thinking of the example of a demonstration when I was a student that we wanted to have as many people come to, and somebody said, "Oh, it's time to break some windows." And the person in charge said, "Well, that's fine for Halloween, you know, but this is, you know, this is serious." And how important is that kind of, you know, direct challenge to that, you know, kind of opposition, or, you know, how do you deal with that?
It can be hard. I mean, especially, a lot depends on the structure of your movement too. If you're talking about Occupy, for example, leaderless, you know, any leader who started to say, "No, we're not going to do that," or "You can't do that," or "It's not is going to actually be shouted down." And so you've got to really, in that kind of movement, develop a cadre of people, a core group of people who are ready to handle that, and who sometimes, rather than confronting the person, make sure that those kinds of people are not alone in the protest. And that they have people with them to make sure things don't get out of hand. So sometimes you do without a confrontation. On the other hand, there are times if an organization or movement action is set up where there are clear leaders who are respected, that they can have a big impact on that. And they can, you know, and usually what would happen, the way I talked about earlier, as you're planning the action, discussing why different tactics are better and why others are not going to work and what the goals are. I really do think that unless someone's really intent on property destruction and violence, once you start to talk about what the goal is, and because the overarching goal is to build a movement, which we don't really have yet, a mass movement. We have little bits and pockets. We don't have a mass movement. And you don't grow a mass movement by violence. People don't want to be part of a guerrilla war with the United States. And so if you're clear about what the goal is, I think it becomes pretty evident. You don't want to turn people over. The major purpose of a protest of a senator or a CEO or a corporation is not to influence that senator, CEO, or corporation. It's to show people that there is effort to fight this issue, so they have somewhere to join. So you want to make sure that what you do as a protest pulls people in rather than repels people. And that's the major argument against violence and property damage. Now, of course, when you get into property damage, there's lots of different levels. And for example, is breaking into a military base to spray paint a nuclear missile? So that may be acceptable. So you have to discuss these things in detail and really figure it out. But so it can be helpful, but sometimes counterproductive too.
You right there?
Talks were great. I would like you, both of you, to elaborate on the situation with Van Jones, because you're assuming that we all know this stuff, and we don't. And also, and Gloria Steinem's role within the women's liberation movement as a conduit for the CIA funds. That's one. Second thing is, at Brooklyn College, the students, the Palestinian students for social change were infiltrated, and it became a big issue this past year, and it's in court now, I believe. And people found out who the infiltrator was from the NYPD through her Facebook page. So sometimes we can turn around the tools of surveillance on us and use them against others. It's not easy to do, but that was very interesting, the way they found out who she was and what she was posting on the, and finally, a lot of people who've been arrested on so-called terrorism, conspiracy charges now are in the Green Movement and environmental movement. And a lot of they were young folks and who are really not prepared for the kind of pressures that would be brought on them by the state. And so people, after a while, began turning on each other without wanting to, but because they were offered a lower sentence or something like that. So how do we prepare ourselves and our movement for that sort of thing and train, especially younger people, for the type of pressures that will be on us without then repelling people from the movement altogether and scaring people off? And finally, what does Soros give you for breakfast? I'm really curious. What does a billionaire eat?
I don't remember the breakfast as being unusual. But I do remember like taking a break in the middle of breakfast and coming back to the markets and then coming back right to the end. He left us that. So I was pretty impressed with his level of intelligence. You want to comment on Van Jones or anything?
I don't want to comment on Van Jones, but there was I thought this gentleman touched on what I interpreted it to be noting the obliviousness of some of our young people to the fact that they are on the record as they speak on all of these social media platforms. And it reminds me how this meshes with the massive institutional infiltration of black communities in conjunction with the mass black incarceration. Not long ago, about 100 young men were swept up in a raid of a public housing project in the Bronx. 2 years before that, a public housing project in Harlem underwent a similar raid with a similar number of people arrested on felony RICO charges, conspiracy charges. And the conspiracy charges were based upon their conversations, the conversations of these young people in Facebook. And it was established that they knew each other, and therefore the dimensions of the conspiracy were alleged because they liked each other or spoke to each other in Facebook. So this does appear to be part of the culture, and it is now standard operating procedure even for small town police agencies to routinely follow the community through Facebook, to map the interpersonal networks of folks in the community based upon their Facebook conversations. And because of the pervasiveness of the police presence in the black community as the major political project, that means that any mass movement worth being called that will show up in those same standard everyday police patrols of Facebook, and that the prosecutors have already incorporated the RICO approach to dealing with Facebook evidentiary material.
Was that drug related?
Hmm?
Was the RICO drug related?
Mostly.
Mostly, okay. And
When
talk
you say
to what that
drug-related,
means.
Crimes related to allegations of drug networks, yeah.
I like the concept of police patrolling Facebook. That's something we should
That's what
get-
they do.
That's what we should get out there, the routine police patrol. I'm not gonna say much about, I don't really know much about Gloria Steinem, but Van Jones, with the beginning of the organizing the Occupy in Washington DC, we started going public in April of 2010, and the actual occupation started in September in Washington, in Wall Street, and started in October for ours. And that was intentional, to break them up so we could keep things going. We didn't know what would continue. But we started to organize. One of the things we did organize was to reach out to people who were politically active and recognizable, to get them to say, I'll come to the Occupy, I'll be participating in it. And one of the people we reached out to was Van Jones, and he was like one of the people who refused to even answer, but we heard through his staff that he thought it was too radical. And he only became involved after it was starting to get successful. And he met with some select group of occupiers in Washington. I wasn't part of that meeting. And a lot of occupiers are writing articles about Van Jones, because the media anointed him the leader of the Occupy movement. And so he was on talking about the Occupy movement, he was like he was the leader of it, and urging how they were going to run all these candidates for various offices as Democrats in the Occupy movement. And there was a big reaction from the Occupy movement about that, and first off claiming to be a leader or pretending to be a leader, and then second off, trying to push us into the Democratic Party. So it was a pretty strong reaction to it. But then he did his own Occupy thing that kind of was a mimicking of Occupy that didn't quite go so well. It didn't quite get the traction, and despite a very flamboyant announcement on almost with fireworks surrounding him coming on stage, it didn't quite do what needed to be done to make the movement happen. So.
What about young people and preparing young people?
Oh, the young people in the long sentences. Well, I mean, that is boy. And we're facing that in Washington, D.C. right now. There was a Black Bloc protest that was part of the January 20th inauguration protests. And the police did a roundup arrest, 200 arrests. They seized everybody's social media and searched through it. People are now facing 10-year charges. And they couldn't really get them on individual charges. They couldn't say that person broke that window. They could just get that they were part of the crowd running, and were arrested at the scene. And so now they're using conspiracy charges, which are very dangerous because they allow for any member of the conspiracy to be blamed for any action that was part of the conspiracy. So one person burns a limousine, if you're a part of the conspiracy, and they're facing 10-year sentences. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I was a criminal defense lawyer, and when someone's facing a 10-year sentence or more, that's an incredible pressure. I don't know if you can prepare someone to really handle that personally. I don't know how you prepare someone to face going to jail for 10 years. You know, Ajamu Baraka does a great job of explaining the commitment that people make when they join a movement that's seeking revolutionary change or transformational change. And I think that would have to be that kind of long time, broad discussion of what it means to be part of a truly, you know, transformative movement. Because the pressures are increasing in the criminal justice system. There, as people know, they're passing laws around the country that make it easier to entrap people. Well, I don't really think you can prepare someone to face 10 years in pressure plus type of possibilities without becoming, it's very hard. I know when I was with Normal, I was their chief counsel of the marijuana lobby, and we had a really great legal committee, hundreds of the best lawyers in the country. I learned more in a half-day legal seminar at Normal than I learned in a year of law school. There were Black Panther lawyers, there were Chicago 8, there were, you know, all sorts of weathermen,